Planted Harper's smirk deepened, her satisfaction palpable. She exchanged a brief glance with Mitchell before turning back to Nathaniel. "This looks serious, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Care to explain why this was in your trunk?" Nathaniel's heart raced, a cacophony of disbelief and fury surging through him. He clenched his fists, struggling to suppress the eruption of emotions threatening to break through his composed exterior. "This is absurd," he said firmly, his voice rising slightly. "I've never seen that bag before. You're making a mistake, officer." But Harper was unmoved. She gestured toward Mitchell, who was already snapping photos of the bag and its contents. The scene felt surreal to Nathaniel, like a grotesque nightmare from which he could not awaken. "Turn around, Mr. Carter," Harper ordered coldly, reaching for her handcuffs. Nathaniel hesitated for a moment, his mind racing through his options. Should he resist, speak up louder, call for legal representation? But he knew too well how quickly these situations could spiral out of control. Reluctantly, he complied, turning to face the Audi as Harper cuffed his wrists behind his back. "You're under arrest for possession of controlled substances," Harper declared, her tone formal but devoid of any empathy. Nathaniel could feel the cold metal of the cuffs biting into his skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the setting sun that now felt distant and mocking. "This is a grave mistake," he said as calmly as he could muster. "I'm Judge Nathaniel Carter, and I will prove my innocence. This is a blatant violation of my rights." Harper scoffed, her expression one of disdain. "Save it for the courtroom, Judge," she retorted, the title sounding more like an insult than a recognition of his position. Much more important, as Nathaniel stood there, humiliated and restrained, the onlookers' murmurs grew louder. Some of them recognized him, their shock evident in their hushed voices. Others simply watched, captivated by the unfolding drama. A few even called out in protest, questioning the officer's actions. "That's Judge Carter. This has to be a mistake," one neighbor exclaimed, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. Another added, "I saw him driving that car last week. He just bought it." The growing crowd seemed to unsettle Mitchell, who turned to Harper with a concerned expression. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the murmurs, "maybe we should double-check the system before taking this further." But Harper waved him off, her resolve unshaken. "We've got enough here," she said dismissively. "Let's take him in." As they escorted Nathaniel toward the patrol car, his mind raced with thoughts of the implications of this moment. The humiliation of being arrested in his own neighborhood, the potential damage to his reputation, and, most importantly, the undeniable reminder of the systemic prejudice he had fought against his entire life. As Nathaniel was placed in the back seat of the patrol car, he caught the eye of a young black boy standing on the sidewalk with his mother. The boy's wide-eyed stare pierced through him, a stark reminder of how much work was still needed to break the chains of prejudice. Nathaniel straightened his posture, determined not to let this incident define him. If anything, it would fuel his resolve to fight harder for justice. The ride to the station was silent, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the police radio. Nathaniel's thoughts were a whirlwind, replaying every moment of the encounter, searching for a clue, a strategy, a way to reclaim his dignity and expose the injustice he had just endured. By the time they arrived at the station, news of his arrest had already begun to spread. Harper led him inside, her demeanor as unyielding as ever. But Nathaniel noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Several officers in the precinct seemed taken aback as they recognized him, their expressions ranging from shock to discomfort. "What's going on here?" a voice demanded from across the room. Nathaniel turned to see Captain Maria Rodriguez, the precinct's commanding officer, striding toward them. Her sharp gaze darted between Harper, Mitchell, and Nathaniel. "This man was found with illegal substances in his vehicle," Harper explained confidently, holding up the evidence bag containing the mysterious packets. Rodriguez's eyes narrowed as she looked at Nathaniel. "Judge Carter," she said, her tone laced with disbelief, "is this true?" Nathaniel met her gaze, his composure unwavering. "Absolutely not, Captain," he replied firmly. "This is a mistake, or worse, a deliberate setup. I demand that this matter be investigated thoroughly." Rodriguez turned to Harper, her expression unreadable. "Did you confirm the vehicle registration and ownership?" she asked, her voice sharp. Harper hesitated for the first time, her confidence faltering. "Not yet, ma'am," she admitted. "But the vehicle matches the description of a stolen car." "And did you check the system to verify that claim?" Rodriguez interrupted, her tone icy. Harper's silence was all the answer she needed. "Uncuff him," Rodriguez ordered, her voice leaving no room for argument. Harper hesitated, but a pointed glare from Rodriguez prompted her to obey. As Nathaniel's wrists were freed, he rubbed them, his expression calm but resolute. "Judge Carter," Rodriguez said, turning to him, "I deeply apologize for this incident. I assure you we will investigate this matter thoroughly and hold anyone accountable for any wrongdoing." Nathaniel nodded, his voice steady. "Thank you, Captain, but I expect more than just apologies. This isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows this kind of prejudice to persist." Rodriguez met his gaze, her expression serious. "You have my word," she said. "This will not be swept under the rug." Rodriguez moved back to her seat as Sarah backed toward the board. As Nathaniel left the precinct, the weight of the incident still heavy on his shoulders, he knew this was far from over. The fight for justice was never easy, but he was determined to use his position and his voice to ensure that no one else would have to endure what he had experienced. Toward Mitchell, her eyes narrowing. "And what does that mean?" she snapped, though her voice carried less bite than before. Mitchell hesitated, then sighed, his gaze drifting back to Nathaniel. "It means," Mitchell said cautiously, "that sometimes we need to trust more than just appearances or assumptions. Look at him. His demeanor, his words, they don't fit the profile of someone guilty of stealing a car or planting evidence. Maybe we're letting our biases cloud our judgment." Harper clenched her jaw, feeling the weight of his words. She glanced at Nathaniel again, standing tall despite the cuffs on his wrists, his face calm but resolute, as if he knew the truth would prevail. It unnerved her. The quiet confidence in his eyes, the absence of fear, even in the face of blatant injustice. The silence between them grew heavier, broken only by the faint hum of the car engines and the distant murmur of the onlookers. Harper turned abruptly and marched toward her patrol car, pulling out her radio. "Dispatch," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Run a check on a Judge Nathaniel Carter and confirm registration for an Audi, license plate ending in 4872. Mitchell watched her closely, his arms crossed, as the seconds ticked by like hours. Nathaniel remained silent, though his piercing gaze never left Harper. She could feel the weight of his unspoken words, the challenge in his silence, daring her to confront the truth. The crackle of the radio snapped everyone's attention. "Dispatch here," the voice responded. "Judge Nathaniel Carter is a verified resident of Woodridge Heights. The Audi, license plate 4872, is registered in his name. No reports of theft associated with this vehicle." Harper's shoulders stiffened, the weight of the confirmation hitting her like a tidal wave. Mitchell exhaled slowly, relief evident on his face, though his gaze still carried a hint of reproach. Nathaniel lifted his chin slightly, his voice calm but firm. "As I said, officer, this is my car, and I've done nothing wrong. Now, I suggest you uncuff me and explain to me and everyone here why this has happened." Harper hesitated, her pride clashing with a growing sense of guilt and shame. The onlookers murmured louder, their phones still recording, documenting every moment. She knew there was no escaping the consequences of her actions, not from the public, not from her department, and certainly not from Nathaniel Carter. Reluctantly, she signaled Mitchell, who stepped forward and unlocked the handcuffs. As the cold metal fell away, Nathaniel rubbed his wrists but didn't step back. His eyes remained locked on Harper, unwavering. "Officer Harper," he began, his tone measured but cutting. "What you've done tonight isn't just a mistake. It's a failure of judgment, one rooted in prejudice. You didn't see me as a man driving home after work. You saw me as a threat simply because of my skin color, and that bias led to this moment, a moment that could have ended far worse for someone else. Consider that." Harper swallowed hard, unable to meet his gaze. The weight of the crowd's judgment and her own conscience pressed down on her, leaving her unable to form a response. Nathaniel adjusted his sleeves and turned toward the onlookers. "For those of you watching, this is what systemic prejudice looks like," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "But let this also be a reminder that we cannot stay silent in the face of injustice. Record it, speak out, and demand accountability. That's the only way we change this system." With that, he turned back to his car, opened the door, and sat inside. He paused for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel, before taking a deep breath. The ordeal wasn't over, but for now, he had reclaimed his dignity. Harper watched him drive away, the sound of the engine fading into the night. She felt Mitchell's eyes on her, but couldn't bring herself to look at him. Instead, she stared at the ground, her mind racing with thoughts she wasn't ready to confront. Mitchell finally broke the silence. "You need to reflect on this, Harper," he said softly. "We both do. Tonight could have ended so much worse. Think about that." Harper nodded slightly, though her expression remained blank. She walked back to her patrol car, the weight of the night's events pressing down on her. Somewhere deep inside, she knew Mitchell was right. Tonight was a wake-up call, one she couldn't afford to ignore. Martinez crossed the lawn with deliberate steps, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the gathered crowd. "Officer," she began, her tone firm but calm. "I've lived here for over a decade. That man," she gestured toward Nathaniel, "is Judge Nathaniel Carter. He's been a part of this community longer than most of us. Whatever you're accusing him of, you'd better have more than a suspicious bag to justify this." Harper stiffened, the weight of the situation pressing down on her even harder. The murmurs grew louder, fueled by Martinez's intervention. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, his hands falling to his sides, no longer gripping the bag as tightly as before. "This isn't about the community's opinion," Harper replied, her voice defensive but lacking its former edge. "We're following protocol." Martinez's eyes narrowed. "Protocol? I've seen a lot of so-called protocol in my life, officer, and I know when someone's being railroaded. If you're not willing to confirm his identity, then you're not seeking justice, you're avoiding it." Harper turned her gaze away from Martinez, her hands fidgeting slightly at her sides. She glanced back at Nathaniel, whose piercing stare hadn't wavered since the ordeal began. "This isn't personal," she muttered. almost as though she were trying to convince herself. "Then stop making it personal," Nathaniel interjected, his voice steady and unwavering. "You have a duty to uphold the law, not distort it based on bias or fear. Call in the checks, Harper. Do what's right, not what's convenient." Mitchell took a step closer to Harper, his voice low but firm. "Harper, we need to stop this before it gets worse. He's not resisting. He's asking for us to verify his identity. If we don't, we're the ones in the wrong." For a moment, Harper stood silent, her expression a storm of conflict. The weight of her past mistakes, the fear of judgment from her superiors, and the pressure from the growing crowd all swirled within her. But Martinez's unwavering gaze and Nathaniel's commanding presence seemed to cut through the noise in her mind. Finally, she exhaled deeply and turned to Mitchell. "Run the plate," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Let's confirm everything." Mitchell nodded and walked back to the squad car, the tension in the air easing slightly as he got to work. Harper, however, remained rooted to the spot, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression unreadable. Martinez stayed nearby, watching Harper with a mixture of disdain and pity. "You did the right thing, officer," she said after a moment. "But don't think people will forget how this started." Harper didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed on Nathaniel, who stood tall and silent, his composure unshaken despite the ordeal. Minutes felt like hours as the crowd waited in tense silence. The soft hum of Mitchell's voice on the radio and the occasional crackle of static were the only sounds breaking the stillness. Finally, Mitchell returned, his expression serious. He held up a sheet of paper. "Everything checks out," he announced, his voice carrying over the gathered onlookers. "The car is registered to Judge Nathaniel Carter. The theft report was a clerical error. It was meant for a different vehicle with a similar description." The revelation sent a ripple through the crowd, and the murmurs grew louder. Nathaniel's gaze never left Harper, who now looked visibly shaken. Harper stepped forward, fumbling slightly as she reached for the keys to unlock Nathaniel's handcuffs. I'm sorry, Judge Carter," she said, her voice barely audible. Nathaniel didn't respond immediately. He rubbed his wrists, the red marks stark against his skin, before looking directly at Harper. "Your apology is noted," he said, his tone even but firm. "But this doesn't end here, Officer Harper. What happened tonight is a symptom of something far deeper, a systemic issue that needs addressing. I hope you reflect on this moment and what it means for the people you serve." Harper opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she stepped back, her gaze falling to the ground. Martinez crossed her arms, watching the scene with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. "Justice has a way of finding the truth," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Nathaniel turned to the crowd, offering a faint nod to the neighbors who had stood in silent support. Without another word, he walked toward his house, his steps measured and dignified. The crowd slowly began to disperse, the weight of what they had witnessed leaving an indelible mark on their minds. Harper and Mitchell stood by the squad car, the flashing lights now feeling less like symbols of authority and more like harsh reminders of the night's events. Mitchell placed a hand on Harper's shoulder. "You made the right call in the end," he said quietly. Harper shook her head, her eyes distant. "The right call doesn't erase the wrong ones," she replied, her voice heavy with regret. As the last of the neighbors retreated into their homes, the street fell into an uneasy quiet. But for Harper, the silence was deafening, filled with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answers to. as if trapped in a waking nightmare, her face pale and her confidence utterly drained. Harper's gaze shifted between Holloway, Nathaniel, and the growing crowd, her expression a mix of defiance, regret, and shame. "Captain," she finally murmured, her voice barely audible, "I thought I was following protocol. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to what, Officer Harper?" Nathaniel interrupted, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Didn't mean to handcuff a man in his own neighborhood without verifying his identity? Didn't mean to humiliate me in front of my community? Or didn't mean to reveal the very prejudice you claim doesn't exist?" Harper's lips pressed into a thin line, unable to muster a response. The crowd, now larger and angrier, murmured louder in agreement with Nathaniel's words. The flashing lights from phones illuminated the scene, every angle captured and broadcast for the world to see. "Mr. Carter," Holloway began, stepping closer in an attempt to de-escalate, "I understand your frustration, and I agree that this situation was mishandled. I will ensure—" Nathaniel raised a hand, stopping Holloway mid-sentence. "Captain, my frustration doesn't begin to cover it. You may understand what went wrong here, but do you understand the consequences? The erosion of trust between law enforcement and the very people you are supposed to serve? This isn't about me alone. It's about everyone who has faced this same injustice and been silenced." A tense silence followed, broken only by the muffled sound of neighbors whispering among themselves. Harper shifted uncomfortably, her hands fidgeting at her sides as she avoided meeting anyone's gaze. "Captain Holloway," Linda interjected, stepping forward with unwavering resolve, "this neighborhood isn't just watching, we're taking notes. We've seen too much and we won't tolerate it anymore. This isn't just a matter of protocol, it's a matter of decency and respect." Holloway sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as he struggled to find the right words. "You're right," he finally said, turning back to Nathaniel. "Mr. Carter, on behalf of this department, I sincerely apologize. This never should have happened." Nathaniel nodded slowly, his eyes piercing through Holloway's veneer of authority. "An apology is a start, Captain, but it isn't enough. Change is what's needed. Real, systemic change, not just words spoken in the heat of the moment." "I'll see to it," Holloway replied, his tone solemn. "Officer Harper's actions will be reviewed, and I will take personal responsibility to ensure incidents like this don't occur again." The crowd stirred, some murmuring their approval while others remained skeptical. Harper, who had remained silent, suddenly spoke up. I was wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "I let my judgment be clouded by my past. It wasn't fair to you, Mr. Carter, or to anyone else here." Nathaniel studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Acknowledging your bias is the first step, Officer Harper, but understanding its impact and actively working to change it, that's what truly matters. Words mean little without action." Harper swallowed hard, nodding. "I'll do better," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Holloway turned back to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask for your understanding as we address this incident. Your voices matter, and I assure you, we are listening." Linda crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "We'll hold you to that, Captain. This neighborhood deserves better. Nathaniel deserves better." Nathaniel turned to Linda, a faint smile softening his otherwise stern demeanor. "Thank you, Linda. Your courage means more than I can say." Belinda returned the smile. "We stand together, Nathaniel, always." As the crowd began to disperse, some lingering to ensure everything was truly resolved, Nathaniel finally walked toward his car. The marks from the handcuffs were still visible on his wrists, a painful reminder of the night's events. Holloway and Harper watched as Nathaniel got into his Audi, his composure intact despite everything he had endured. Before closing the door, he looked back at them one last time. "Captain," he said, his tone firm, "make sure this is the last time something like this happens. The world is watching." With that, he started his car and drove away, leaving behind a scene etched into the memories of everyone present. The flashing lights of the police cars faded into the night, but the impact of what had occurred lingered heavily in the air. Harper stood motionless, the weight of her actions pressing down on her, while Holloway silently vowed to address the systemic issues that had allowed the situation to unfold. The echoes of the community's voices, unified in their demand for justice, resonated long after the streets had emptied, a stark reminder of the work still left to be done. Harper stood, pale and tense, her hands clasped tightly together, as Captain Holloway turned toward her, his voice sharp with disappointment. "Did you even check the vehicle's information, Harper?" he demanded, his tone cutting through the lingering tension. Harper hesitated, her voice barely audible as she replied, "I was going to, Captain, but you didn't," Holloway interrupted, his voice cold as steel. "And for that, you will be held accountable." Nathaniel took a step forward, his piercing gaze meeting Holloway's directly. His voice, measured yet firm, carried a weight that silenced the murmurs of the surrounding crowd. "Captain, I'm not here for empty apologies or vague promises. I want to know, right now, how this system will change to ensure this doesn't happen again, not just to me, but to anyone." The gathered neighbors, still recording the scene, held their collective breath. Holloway stood silent for a moment, the pressure of the crowd's gaze and the weight of Nathaniel's words pressing down on him. He understood that Nathaniel wasn't just speaking for himself. He was a voice for countless others who had endured similar injustices in silence for far too long. "I give you my word," Holloway finally said, his voice deliberate and steady. "Every necessary action will be taken. Harper will be held accountable for her decisions today, and I will ensure no one else has to endure what you did." Nathaniel's eyes didn't waver, his tone ice-cold as he responded, "I'll hold you to that, Captain. But remember this, your promises will be judged by your actions, not by the hollow words I've heard far too many times before." Holloway nodded, but he knew this situation was far from resolved. It wasn't just about one incident or one officer's poor judgment. It was a glaring reminder of the systemic flaws that could no longer be ignored. And Nathaniel Carter, with his unyielding stance and commanding presence, had brought those flaws into sharp focus. The weight of the moment was palpable. Holloway's shoulders sagged slightly under the strain of the responsibility now squarely on his shoulders. He glanced back at Harper, who stood frozen, her face pale and her expression blank, yet betraying the deep unease brewing within her. She hadn't spoken a word since Holloway's arrival, but the turmoil in her eyes spoke volumes. Nathaniel turned his sharp gaze to her, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Do you have anything to say, Officer Harper, or will you continue hiding behind your superior?" Harper blinked, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. She was trapped in a moment of reckoning, forced to confront her own actions or inactions that had led to this point. She wanted to defend herself, to explain, but she knew that no excuse could undo what had been done. "Captain," Harper finally managed, her voice trembling and lacking its usual authority, I think we need to clarify everything before the community. It's our responsibility." Holloway nodded, sensing that the tension needed immediate resolution. Turning back to Nathaniel, he spoke in a measured tone. "Judge Carter, you're right. We will hold a public press conference to acknowledge our mistakes. I also commit to implementing training and reforms to ensure this never happens again." Nathaniel's gaze didn't soften. He nodded slightly but spoke with the same unrelenting edge. "I'll be watching your actions, Captain." Let me warn you, if I see even a hint of a lack of transparency, I'll bring this entire story to the media. I have nothing to lose, but you do." The words hung heavily in the air, thick with tension and the weight of accountability. The neighbors, still recording, murmured quietly among themselves, the gravity of Nathaniel's warning resonating with them all. Holloway nodded again, acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. On his report to the board, in the days that followed, the events of that night spread rapidly across social media. Videos of Judge Nathaniel Carter, a respected figure in the community, being handcuffed and treated as a suspect, sparked widespread outrage. Hashtags demanding justice trended as discussions about systemic bias in law enforcement erupted across platforms. Nathaniel seized the moment to drive meaningful change. He organized a community meeting at the local cultural center, inviting not just residents but also activists, journalists, and leaders from various organizations. The goal wasn't merely to recount the events of that night, but to start a broader conversation about systemic injustice and the need for real reform. The cultural center was packed, with standing room only as people crowded in to hear Nathaniel speak. He stood at the podium, his presence commanding but approachable. His voice carried through the room, calm but unwavering in its conviction. "What happened to me is not unique," he began, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "It is a symptom of a much larger problem, a system that allows bias to fester unchecked, that prioritizes authority over accountability, and that too often fails the very people it is meant to serve." Applause rippled through the room as Nathaniel continued, outlining specific reforms he wanted to see implemented. Mandatory bias training for officers, community oversight committees, and transparent procedures for addressing misconduct. His words were met with nods of agreement, murmurs of support, and the occasional shout of encouragement from the audience. Throughout the meeting, Nathaniel remained steadfast in his message. This wasn't just about him or his experience. It was about creating a system where no one else would have to endure the humiliation, fear, and frustration he had felt that night. Holloway, who had been seated near the back of the room, listened intently. His earlier resolve to protect his team at all costs had given way to a deeper understanding of his responsibility as a leader. He knew that the changes Nathaniel was advocating for weren't just necessary, they were long overdue. And, as the meeting concluded, the crowd gave Nathaniel a standing ovation. The event had become more than just a response to one night's events. It was a call to action for the entire community, and as the attendees filed out, many stopped to thank Nathaniel, expressing their gratitude for his courage and determination. Nathaniel stood near the exit, shaking hands and exchanging words of encouragement with those who approached him. Though he was exhausted, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. That night had been a turning point, not just for him, but for the community and perhaps, in time, for the system itself. Nathaniel stepped onto the stage, his eyes scanning the crowd, sensing their support and expectation. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice resonant yet warm. "What happened to me that night wasn't just a personal mistake. It was a reflection of a deeper systemic issue, how we treat each other based on prejudice and false assumptions." Nathaniel recounted his experience, the humiliation and disregard he felt, and shared similar stories he'd encountered throughout his career. But he didn't linger on the past. Instead, he called for action. "We can't change the past, but we can shape the future. That begins with acknowledging our mistakes and committing to correcting them." Among the attendees was Harper, sitting near the back, her head slightly bowed as she listened intently. When Nathaniel concluded his speech, he surprised everyone by inviting her to speak. The room turned its attention to Harper, and she felt the weight of their gaze. As Harper stepped forward, her voice trembled but held determination. "I want to start by saying I'm deeply sorry, but apologies aren't enough. I commit to undergoing training on implicit bias and working with this community to create regular dialogues between law enforcement and residents." She paused, glancing at Nathaniel. "Starting tomorrow, I will lead a project to improve relationships between the police and the community. This isn't just about making amends. It's a commitment to building something better." Her words silenced the crowd. While some skepticism lingered, others nodded in agreement. Harper spoke about the pressures she'd faced, the fear of losing her job, and the biases she hadn't recognized in herself. "But pressure is no excuse," she admitted. "Bias has no place in the work of a police officer. I see now that if I don't change, I'll harm not only others, but also myself." Her voice grew steadier as she continued. "That night, I didn't just hurt Judge Carter. I undermined the very value I thought I stood for: justice. I can't change what happened, but I can commit to learning from it. And I want to do more than change myself. I want to help build a fairer system." She met Nathaniel's gaze, an unspoken acknowledgement of his role in holding her accountable. "Thank you, Judge Carter, for forcing me to face this." The room fell silent, not with judgment, but with a collective sense of reflection. Nathaniel nodded slightly, saying nothing, but his expression suggested understanding. This was a step toward the change he hoped to see. Harper's words, though unable to undo the past, carried a sincerity that left many in the room deep in thought. She pledged to attend training programs and work toward repairing not only her mistakes, but also systemic issues within her department. The meeting ended, but the story continued to spread. Videos of Nathaniel in handcuffs, under the flashing lights of police cars, became focal points in national conversations. Hashtags like "Justice for Nathaniel" and "End Racial Bias" trended rapidly. Articles, posts, and comments flooded in, demanding reforms in law enforcement. One widely shared video featured George, a veteran neighbor, stating, "This isn't just Nathaniel's story, it's the story of all of us, of our need for a system that is fair and free of bias. We, the residents of Woodridge Heights, won't stay silent." The outrage on social media compelled the police department to hold a public press conference. Harper, despite her commitments to change, continued to face scrutiny from the community. Nathaniel, in interviews, emphasized, "Change doesn't come from apologies, it comes from action and transparency." The story didn't end with the community meeting. It became a wake-up call, a reminder of the power of unity and accountability in the fight for justice. Nathaniel felt a sense of hope, but he knew hope must be sustained by action. This battle was part of a long journey, but he was ready to face it not just for himself, but for others who had and would face injustice. Nathaniel felt a sense of hope, but for others who had and would face it. As night fell and the neighborhood quieted, the echoes of the meeting continued to resonate, igniting a larger movement against bias and injustice. Nathaniel, with a steadfast stride, walked into the night as an unwavering guide, his story a mirror reflecting the realities many face every day. Injustice and prejudice may persist, but so too does the determination to confront them head-on.